I'm a teacher and a mother and a wife, and I also define myself as an activist. And I'm an activist. I'm active for things, actions, ideas, understandings that sustain people and communities.
When people rise up, when voices gather in unison to call for justice, there's always hope that the world will shift. Protest is both an act of courage and of faith. Faith that truth, when spoken loudly enough, cannot be ignored. And yet, time and time again, we witness how slowly change comes. Laws may bend, systems may tremble, but the deeper structures of power often remain unmoved. The cycle repeats, a spark of outrage, the swell of resistance, the silence of fatigue, and the return of the same struggles in a different disguise. In this episode, you'll hear from women who know this cycle well. They have stood on the front lines of protest, not in distant lands, but here at home. They've marched, spoken up, resisted, gone to jail, and carried the weight of believing that their voices could turn the tide. These are not just stories of protest, they are stories of persistence, disappointment, resilience, and the question we all face: how do we keep fighting when so little seems to change? Welcome to Stories. I'm your host, Delia Quigley, and this episode is Protest Wars, Stories from the Home Front. So, Delia, is this episode about politics? No, it's not about politics, but it is about people. I'm not here to argue sides, but to witness the cost on the body, on the heart, on the soul of humanity when people take to the street in protest over injustice. This episode is a place for stories that go untold, often silenced, often overlooked, or for some too painful to tell. It is about women who have stood with others to protect the future of their sons and their daughters, their grandchildren, their homes, and the certainty of a secure life with equality for all.
I started to focus my activism more around the environment and human connection to the environment, and became very concerned, of course, about climate change. So about 10 years ago, I decided I needed to step up my activism, which to that point had been writing letters, visiting legislators, taking part in marches or protests that support good environmental policy. And I decided I need to go a step further. Bill McKibben called for a civil disobedience action at the White House to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. And I decided I was going to be part of the civil disobedience. We were supposed to go to the White House, dress very nicely, be calm, be peaceful, show signs that say to President Obama, who was the president at the time and was thinking about giving permission for this terrible pipeline that would carry horrible tar sands oil from Canada right down to the Gulf of Mexico through badly built pipelines that always leak, destroying aquifers and farms and ranches and people's lives. We were supposed to stand in front of the White House, calmly ask for renewable energy, and when the Park Service, the National Park Service, asked us to move, we would not move. And that's exactly what we did. And we were supposed to pay a fine and then go home. That's not what happened. We ended up having to stay in jail for about 3 days after we were arrested. We were in 3 different jails, and that was an experience unto itself. The main story I want to tell about that is our last day in jail was in a federal prison. And the 13 of us who were together as a group, we were all white women, and we were in a jail cell next to a whole group of Black women. And they looked over at us and said, "What the hell are you white women doing in this jail?" They never saw a big group of white women like us sitting in a jail cell. So Bonnie, who was part of our group, I won't say her last name, but she was part of our group. She was a school teacher from Oregon. She gets up and she starts telling the women that we're in jail because, we need 350 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. We can't go above that. And we have to convince President Obama that tar sands oil is bad. And the women were looking at her like, what are you talking about? This language had nothing to do with their experience. So we kind of all said, Bonnie, audience. And so she changed her approach. And she said, look, have you ever been out in DC when it's so hot that you can't breathe? And they all said, yeah, in fact, that's why we're here. We were sitting on the steps last night. It was so hot. We couldn't be in our apartments. It was awful. And we got arrested for making too much noise out on the street because their apartment was too hot to be inside of. So Bonnie continued and said, well, how about, when it's hard to breathe? They said, we know that. And one of the women said, yeah, my son has asthma. I have to rush him to the hospital some days because he can't breathe. And she explained to them that that is what we're putting into the air. These women who had not had the opportunity for education that Bonnie had, she understood, well, I need to give them some context here. I need to give them some background. By the time she was done with her explanation, we had all connected to each other. She really connected to them and they to her. And they said they were happy we were doing this, that we were fighting the man, they said. Fight the man who's making us rush to the emergency room with our children because they can't breathe on certain days. And by the time they opened the jail cell and let us out, we were leaving first, those women were applauding us. And I realized, through my whole life of understanding how we create these differences that don't exist in our connections as human beings, that there's always bridges. If we're willing to build them, we can all learn how to do that. And that's what I've learned through my life. Build bridges and be strong against people who tear bridges down. And that's the basis of my activism now. And my decision to lead an indivisible group in these very trying times, because we have a government now that is not about unity, is not about helping communities thrive, but is about division. And that will never be a thing that I will let lay. I will always, always stand against that.
That was Virginia Kennedy. She's an adjunct professor of English at SUNY Oneonta in central New York. Her PhD research and publications have centered on exploring different cultural relationships to the environment. She's been a lifelong activist working towards sustaining the earth that sustains us all. You can read more about her in our contributors page here on Stories. Okay, so Delia, what was the first protest that you took part in? Well, I remember it was around 1969, and there was to be a sit-in at my university. The student body was to meet in protest against the Vietnam War. So we all gathered in the large entrance foyer of the building, basically sitting on the floor and blocking the entrance. There may have been a few speeches, but there was no chanting or raised fists. It was all pretty quiet. Then the police arrived and made everyone move out of the building. A few days later, I was called into the dean's office. I was 18 years old, my hair braided in pigtails, and there he was telling me I was a viper to the breast of the university. It was pretty hard not to laugh. I went home and told my father, who was a colonel in the United States Army and had done a brutal year in Vietnam. I told him how I felt about war, which at that point he totally understood. So next day I returned to school, and no more was said about it.
I answered my phone, and to my surprise, on the other end was a reporter wanting information about a demonstration I had been in. I was very curious about which demonstration that might have been. And she's referring to a demonstration outside of Jimmy Carter's church in Washington, D.C. in 1978. That's nearly 50 years ago. And she explained that she was a parishioner. She was a reporter. She was a writer. And she was doing some research and a presentation to her church. She wanted me to remember and know that Jimmy Carter was a Sunday school teacher. Besides being president, why were we there? She reminded me that this was on August 6th, Sunday, August 6th, 1978. And I said, oh, well, August 6th is Hiroshima Day. People very often make demonstrations about the terrible bomb that fell on Hiroshima in hopes that this would not happen again. But on that particular day, we were demonstrating about the neutron bomb. Now, the neutron bomb is an interesting bomb because it was designed to kill people while doing no damage to buildings and property. And it happens to be that we were not alone in our voices of protest because the development of this bomb ceased. So our voices, those voices on that day, Jack Egan, Esther and Barry Cassidy, and several others from the Atlantic Life community, we were there protesting, appealing truth to power. We were appealing to a man with a conscience. We were appealing to someone that believed in life, that had Christian values. I think that this reporter who was listening, calling me up and talking to me about this, heard me. I think she understood. I think I answered her question. But it reminded me that our voices, they go through time. They can be heard. There are issues we can voice. We can speak to power. And it gives me courage to continue to speak out, to encourage others to speak out, to show up at vigils, to show up at demonstrations, to call my congresspeople, to continue this work. There are many things that are happening that we can speak up on, and we should.
We just heard from Sharon Pontier, longtime activist and artist, mother, grandmother, one who stands for those who will not speak and those who cannot speak. You can read more about her on our contributor page here on Stories. So, Delia, wasn't there some kind of demonstration or that you took part in for the Hiroshima Day to mark the 39th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima? Yeah, it was 1984. Oh, it was a hot Sunday afternoon, and we set up the sewing machines near the picnic grove on Siesta Key Beach. We came there to mark the 39th anniversary, right, of the bombing of Hiroshima. My friend Dolph Smith was visiting from the Netherlands and knew his way around a sewing machine. We began as a small group of women, men, and children that grew larger as beachgoers stopped by to see what was taking shape, because what we were there for was to create an 18-inch wide peace ribbon as part of an informal network of peace groups in all parts of the world, including Australia, India, and South Africa. The ribbon's eventual destination was to be the Museum of Peace in Chicago, the Peace Museum, to be hung for Peace Day in 1985. So we set up the tables and chairs. Someone was cutting the donated fabric pieces while others sat and sewed the pieces together. Then we strung them from the trees in the grove, eventually extending quite a distance. When people stopped by and saw what we were doing, they pitched in to help. You know, everyone wants to live in a safe and peaceful world. So they pitched in, and some fabric pieces were transformed into art by adding paint or seashells. People wrote words on them and collage elements. It became a beautiful work of peace art. And it was an amazing display of people coming together in peace and in love to demonstrate their commitment to ending the threat of nuclear warfare. We were hoping the final peace ribbon would be tied around the Pentagon first before heading off to the Peace Museum. And you know what? On August 4th, 1985, the peace ribbon, a collection of thousands of handmade panels, was displayed around the Pentagon, the U.S. Capitol, Lincoln Memorial, and the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. A portion of the ribbon was also displayed around the atomic bomb dome in Hiroshima, Japan. An estimated 15,000 people tied over 30,000 of these panels together to form a continuous 15-mile ribbon. This is what our small band of peace activist citizens contributed to a worldwide effort. The message was sent out loud and clear. So when I wonder what my one voice can do, I remember the quote by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has.
In early 2016, the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in North Dakota began protesting construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline called DAPL, DAPL. It was a dangerous pipeline carrying oil through 4 states between 2 major rivers. And this was a grassroots protest which drew the nation's attention. At the time, as the calls for support went out, I felt very strongly about going. And when I spoke to Mary Thibault, who is a minister, she found herself in a similar position, and we decided to fly out to North Dakota and be a part of this demonstration. We were only going to be there for a brief time. In fact, we had to fly to South Dakota, rent a car, and drive up to the reservation. On the drive, we actually were in a long line of cars entering the reservation, and it was fascinating because there were many cars, there were some buildings, but there were many teepees, actual teepees, and many people dressed in Native American garb. And while we were there, we explored the area, and we were part of a couple of ceremonial activities and observed the signs and interacted with many people there. Now, Standing Rock lost. The pipeline was built, but it was an amazing gathering of indigenous people and supportive people, and it drew great attention to the dangerous environmental impact of these pipelines and what we're doing to our underground waters and the lands that belong to various peoples. It's a powerful memory. It was a powerful trip, a plane ride across the country, lending my voice, lending my body to this cause. And I know that we didn't win in that instance, but we won in another sense because this issue has become visible, and the gathering of peoples was very powerful and empowered other people across the lands.
Delia, you didn't go along with Sharon on that trip? I didn't. I had a whole other experience. I was gathering with a group of people, a community of people in support of what was happening at Standing Rock Reservation. We came together to support the defenders of the sacred who were protecting their water and their land rights. The corporation Energy Transfer Partners had literally sent a private army. And emboldened by the U.S. government's refusal to stop the Dakota pipeline, they set about desecrating sacred land and burial grounds. They brought in bulldozers to plow up Sioux ancestors. They spilled black oil back into water, and that was the greatest fear, the pollution of their sacred Missouri River. That water is needed to sustain life, to grow their food, to wash their babies, to baptize the faithful, and on a warm summer's day to take a nice swim. And the people had stood together the night before, and they were tossed by water hoses pulling from their sacred Missouri and slammed against their freezing bodies. There was mayhem and chaos. People ran in panic from the assault. And there you saw Americans standing on both sides of the battle line. One side, the corporate side, tossed tear gas. The other side yelling back, "Why do you do this to us?" Ironically, it was Thanksgiving Day. And even though their politics may not agree with yours, then listen to their humanity. What would you do to protect your home, your land, the well-being and safety of your family? How far would you go? So Delia, we have time for one more story. What do you have for us? Ooh, I got a really good one. Actually, it's a New York story. And being a New York story, it's got some punch to it. It was October 2010. I drove into New York City with Sharon and another friend of ours. Both of those women were well experienced in the art of protesting, occupying, demonstrating, and being arrested. On the drive in, I listened to these two grandmothers reminisce about their 30 years of peace action work, and they told tales of what they had seen in the trenches. We were headed downtown to the Occupy Wall Street gathering in Zuccotti Park, well, also known as Liberty Square. We had plenty of time to discuss all the possibilities of what might happen at the site. We were making sure to take along bail money, donation funds, as well as the phone numbers of friends who we might need to come to our assistance. It was a beautiful sunny day. The city was teeming with people, and the general mood was light and festive. When we arrived at the park, the first thing that struck me was how small an area the park covered. The second thing was that there were a lot of people and cameras everywhere. There were also police officers working in groups of 4, and then there was the black-windowed NYPD tower looking down on the goings-on. There were protesters inside the park, and then there were tourists circling the area, snapping picture after picture. Spread throughout were artists silk-screening newly purchased I Heart NY t-shirts with the words, Occupy Wall Street. Everybody was focused on the occupation. Once I settled into the crowd, I could see how the park had been organized, really organized to accommodate a makeshift kitchen, a media center, a first aid area. There was a library of books along the wall, and a place to dance and raise a fist or two. It looked like a big sleepover party, but it was, in fact, deadly serious. And the people here had put their lives and futures on the line. Wherever I turned, there were people of all ages, even babies and children and all nationalities, looking, discussing, eating, and sleeping. When the drums started howling, they began to dance and chant, Occupy, Occupy, Occupy. On and on it went. Round and round the park we went, moving in and out again, feeling ever the tourist we had not meant to become. I overheard one well-dressed young woman tell her boyfriend that she didn't want to go into the crowded park. But why, he said. It's the reason we traveled all this way, to be part of what is happening. At one point, Sharon gave a big sigh and told me how jealous she was that she couldn't stay and occupy the park with those who had been there the past few weeks. She took a deep breath and exhaled, feeling the pleasure of being part of another action meant to elicit change in our government. She and I had recently returned from Washington, D.C., where we had marched with 1,000 other people to demand an end to the use of torture at Guantanamo and the war in the Middle East. In the intricate web of protests and demonstrations, you have to see they are all connected and interwoven. End the war, protect our food supply, take care of the 99%. And in Zuccotti Park, the slogans, signs, and quotes were everywhere, written on posters, cardboard, and on T-shirts. We the 99%. Tax Wall Street transactions. Heal America. I'm with you. Be with me. Open your eyes. Imagine and see. Trickle down. BS. I heard someone compare the occupation to the Vietnam War protests, but it's nothing like that. This was the hopelessness of Americans coming together because we did not know what else to do. Our hands had been tied, our rights weakened, our jobs sent offshore, and our resources plundered. It was a collective helplessness that assembled a ragtag army that would not step down in the face of a corrupt authority. You know, it takes courage and patience to continue protesting and not know when you might be attacked. On October 5th, the NYPD pepper sprayed the crowd and arrested 20 demonstrators. In the dead of night on October 10th, the Boston police stormed the tent city of Occupy Boston and arrested 100 people. When I returned home from the city, I fell asleep thinking about the men and women sleeping in the open on a cold October night, dreaming of a hot shower and a warm meal, curled up against a cold stone wall and determined to go the distance, determined to use their voices for those who could not speak, determined to raise their voices for those who would not speak. So, Delia, any final words for your listeners? Well, I think I'm going to let Sharon Pontier have that last word as the wise woman who has stood for so many peace activist demonstrations and protests for all our rights. Okay, here she is.
So I encourage you, my friends, if there's something that's pulling at your heart, join in and find out more about it. Bring your body to the cause. You will be rewarded with the power of the light.
Delia, what did that remind you of when she said the power of the light? Well, of course, Mary Oliver's poem, The Buddha's Last Instruction. Powerful poem. Here, I'm going to read it. Make of yourself a light, said the Buddha, before he died. I think of this every morning as the east begins to tear off its many clouds of darkness, to send up the first signal, a white fan streaked with pink and violet, even green. An old man, he lay down between two solid trees, and he might have said anything, knowing it was his final hour. The light burns upward, it thickens and settles over the fields. Around him the villagers gathered and stretched forward to listen. Even before the sun itself hangs disattached in the blue air, I am touched everywhere by its ocean of yellow waves. No doubt he thought of everything that had happened in his difficult life, and then I feel the sun itself as it blazes over the hills like a million flowers on fire. Clearly, I'm not needed, yet I feel myself turning into something of inexplicable value. Slowly, beneath the branches, he raised his head. He looked into the faces of that frightened crowd. I want to thank my guests Virginia Kennedy and Sharon Pontier for sharing their stories with us and also for their commitment to ensuring a just and peaceful world for all our futures. You've been listening to Stories. I'm your host, Delia Quigley, and you can find this podcast and more on deliaquigley.substack.com. And I want to give a shout out of thanks to my paid subscribers who support my work with their financial assistance. Also, check out my website, deliaq.com, where you will find the mindful mandala cards and mandala talismans. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.